digital ethics, but also a member of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. So in about 7 months, the current National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Shamila Batoy, will be stepping down from her position as the NDPP. And this presents a really important opportunity for civil society and interested parties who are concerned in wanting to make sure that the appointment process of the next NDPP will be open, transparent, be merit-based, and that the person who will be appointed won't just be somebody who is fit and proper, but also a person that has a high level of ethics, integrity, vision, leadership, and determination to prosecute the really serious and complex crime and corruption issues that we have in our country. And I think civil society should play a meaningful role in ensuring that this appointment process will be open, because it was through civil society previously that the last appointment process of the NDPP happened in a way that was, prior to this, fairly unprecedented. There was a selection panel that was established. The interviews were made public, and the media was allowed into those interviews thanks to our friends at the Right to Know campaign. And there was also a standardized process that was followed thanks to the continuous advocacy from by Lawson, Naidu, and KSAC and others. And I think that over the last decade, civil society has played a very important role in ensuring that appointment processes, be it into Chapter 9 or 10 bodies or law enforcement agencies or to the judiciary, follow standard processes, that they allow for meaningful access to the public, where the public is able to comment on CVs and provide objections or support to particular candidates, as well as making sure that those interview processes are open. So, you know, organizations like Corruption Watch, KSAC, the ISS, Helen Suzman Foundation, Judges Matter, the list goes on, have played a very important role to make sure that appointment processes in the public sector follow some type of rules. And we've been vindicated in the sense where now in Parliament there is a set process where they publish CVs and they allow for the public to comment. This was also supported by the recommendations contained in the Zondo Commission reports. But we were also seeing appointment processes that were previously closed, like that of the Inspector General of Intelligence, becoming open, and processes where the president usually has the prerogative in making those appointments like that to the NDPP, the SARS Commissioner, and the National Police Commissioner. What we've seen in this administration is the president has established selection committees that advise him on who should be appointed. And what we know is that in some cases, we've not seen the best results, but it has helped us to cement a path forward on how we can have more established processes in place, and that we're not just making appointments based on political whims, or in the case of a previous NDPP where the appointment was made on a golf course. And in that regard, you know, civil society does deserve its flowers for its precedent-setting work, but we can't take for granted that we'll continue to, you know, have wins in the shifting political terrain that we have. And so today, I'm joined by two of my comrades and collaborators, Lawson Naidu, who is the Executive Secretary from KSAC, as well as Gareth Newham, who is the head of the Justice and Violence Prevention Unit at the Institute for Security Studies. So thank you for participating and welcome to the both of you. Lawson is going to be providing us with some insight into the previous appointment processes of the NDPP and some of the issues that have occurred, whilst Gareth, who has been working closely with the NPA over the last few years, is going to be highlighting matters relating to upcoming vacancies, as well as some succession planning that needs to be happening in the prosecuting authority. So Lawson, we're going to start with you. And maybe you can just remind us of this journey that we've been on and how far we've come, if at all. Lawson, you're on mute.
Good morning. Can you hear me now?
We can.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kavisha. Thank you to Defend Our Democracy for organizing this webinar. As you said, Kavisha, the current NDPP is due to retire at the beginning of next year. And what thought I would do here is to briefly sketch the history of the various national directors of public prosecutions over the years, just to give us a sense of the levels of politicization of the office, political meddling in the office. And I think this will be demonstrated particularly in the manner in which NDPPs in the past have left office or been forced out of office. And I think that might be instructive in terms of ensuring that processes of appointment, not just of the NDPP, but as Gareth will discuss later, other senior appointments in the National Prosecuting Authority are open, transparent, and robust. So the NPA was established in 1998. There have been 9 appointments of NDPP since then, of which 6 were permanent appointments, and there were various acting appointments during those years. As you'll see from my presentation, when people have left or been forced out of office, there have been gaps which were filled by acting NDPPs, and there were not all of them innocuous. Some of them are also quite active politically, which will also be demonstrated. But it's also proven that the NDPP is appointed for a non-renewable 10-year term, and we're a long way from anybody being able to serve a full term. And in fact, even Shamila Batoy's tenure, should she continue until early next year, will actually only be 7 years, and she will be resigning because she will have reached the age of 65, which in terms of the NPA Act requires her to resign. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it demonstrates the instability in the office and the levels of political interference that have ultimately led to many of those NDPPs not serving their full terms in the past. So if we start with Bulelani Nguka, the very first NDPP from 1998, as a member of what was then the Senate, now the National Council of Provinces, Bulelani played an important role in the design and the establishment of the NPA in terms of the legislative framework while he was in Parliament. But a prosecuting authority is always going to be in the spotlight, especially when there are high-profile political cases that the head of the NPA has to manage and endure. And of course, during Bulelani's time, it was the aftermath of the arms deal and the start of the Jacob Zuma corruption saga, which is continuing now, more than a quarter of a century later. The prosecution of Shabir Sheikh happened during the tenure of Bulelani Nguka, and he was criticized heavily at the time and subsequently for not simultaneously prosecuting Jacob Zuma at that time, which is, I think, many people will now say has led to this long drawn-out saga where Zuma has yet to face his day in court. Ultimately, because of those political machinations in the background, Bulelani was accused of being an apartheid-era spy, and this led to his resignation in July of 2004. There was a commission of inquiry, the Heifer Commission, that was established to probe those allegations against Bulelani, but he was cleared, and there was no evidence that he was a spy. But it shows how incumbent NDPPs can be put under political pressure, albeit fake news, as we would now call it, but leads to their departure from office. He was then succeeded by Vusi Pikoli in 2005, appointed by then President Thabo Mbeki. Vusi had been an ANC stalwart, an activist in the struggle in exile, former Director General in the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. Even before that, an advisor to the Minister of Justice, Dullah Omar. Vusi brought a level of stability and continuity from the Bulelani era, and it was during this period that the Scorpions came to the fore as an anti-corruption agency within the NPA, and it was through the Scorpions that the high-profile case of the then National Commissioner of Police, Jackie Selebi, was charged with corruption. And it was that particular action by the NPA and by the Scorpions that led the Minister of Justice to send Mr. Pikoli a letter saying that you shall not proceed with the arrest warrants against Jackie Selebi until you furnish her with all of the information that was used to secure the warrant. And there was clearly, as many of us recognized at the time, improper interference in the independence of the investigative and prosecutorial decision-making of the NPA. This then led to Vusi's suspension by President Mbeki, who asked him to resign in a meeting at the presidential residence in September of 2007, just before President Mbeki was due to leave for the United Nations October meetings in New York. Vusi refused to resign. He was then summarily suspended, and a couple of weeks later, Dr. Freni Ginwala was appointed to chair an inquiry into Vusi Pikoli's fitness to hold office. I must declare at this point that I worked on the Ginwala inquiry as the deputy secretary of that inquiry, so I became very familiar with the processes and the evidence that was led there. This was the first time that, this was the second NDPP and the first time that such an inquiry envisaged under Section 12 of the NPA Act had been instituted. Following quite a detailed process of the Ginwala inquiry, which lasted just over a year. But there was significant political developments during the course of that inquiry. At the ANC conference, National Elective Conference at Polokwane in December of 2007, Jacob Zuma replaced Thabo Mbeki as president of the ANC, and we've seen the political implications of that in the country as a whole since then, but specifically in relation to the NPA as it then was. Shortly after that Polokwane conference, Mr. Mbeki, as we will all remember, was recalled as president of the country by his political party through a decision of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and Mr. Mbeki then tendered his resignation as president. He was succeeded by Kgalema Motlanthe for a period, and in fact, the Ginwala inquiry report was presented to President Motlanthe in early November of 2008. The inquiry found that Mr. Pikoli was indeed fit and proper, despite the fact that there was some evidence to suggest that his handling of some security matters may have been may not have been up to scratch. But the inquiry found that he was fit and recommended that he be reinstated, that his suspension be lifted, and he be reinstated in office. Nevertheless, as we know, the findings of such a commission or inquiry are not binding, and President Motlanthe took the decision, nevertheless, to remove Mr. Pikoli as the national director, had to submit that to Parliament for a resolution by the two houses of Parliament, the National Assembly and the NCAP. which concurred with President Motlanthe, and Vusi Pikoli was removed from office, I think, early in 2009. And I'll come back to the point later, but before the appointment of Menzi Simelane, there was an acting NDPP, Mr. Mokotedi Mshe, which I'll discuss later in terms of the role that he played in the withdrawal of charges against Jacob Zuma, which ultimately led to Mr. Zuma being able to contest the 2009 elections and become president of the Republic. So Menzi was appointed following Jacob Zuma's election as president. He had been a former Director General in the Department of Justice and was, certainly one of the key players behind the scenes in terms of the suspension and the ultimate removal from office of Vusi Pikoli. And there was a lot of tension, which I think is an issue that we also need to focus on regarding the independence of the NPA and the level of accountability to the Department of Justice. Even to this day, the NPA accounts to Parliament through the Department of Justice. It is the DG of Justice that is the accounting officer. And that's an issue I think that is still needs to be resolved. Menzi faced legal challenges over his appointment with both the Supreme Court and the Concord declaring it unlawful and irrational, because amongst things it was found that the evidence that he gave before the Chinwala inquiry, which proved to be untruthful, had been ignored by President Zuma in making that appointment. So again, we can see that this was a highly politicized appointment, that to bring in someone that was close to the president. The president hadn't properly applied his mind to the appointment, and it was set aside, as I say. There was then a bit of a hiatus before the next NDPP was appointed, and CASAC at the time brought an application in the Constitutional Court to force the president to execute his constitutional responsibility to appoint a national director. Once we lodged those court papers, quite quickly thereafter, Mxolisi Nkosana was then appointed as the national director. It was a bit of a surprise appointment, as I say. He was unknown. He was an attorney in KwaZulu-Natal, not really on the a figure or national figure, I should say, at the time. And it was clear that Mr. Zuma felt that in making this appointment, he would be able to influence how Mr. Nkosana carried out his duties as the NDPP. But as Mr. Zuma soon found out, Mr. Nkosana took his responsibility seriously and began to act without fear, favor, or prejudice. And there were concerns in the Zuma camp at the time that the corruption charges that had been quashed under Mokotedi Mshe might be reinstated. This led to various digging up dirt on Nkosana, including the fact that he had failed to disclose that he had been charged with murder, although acquitted. He had not disclosed that. And this led to the denial of a security clearance. And this formed the basis of President Zuma then instituting an inquiry into the fitness of Mr. Nkosana to hold office. As is known now from the Corruption Watch, Freedom Under Law, and CASAC litigation that followed the golden handshake of approximately 17 million rand. Basically, he was paid out for the balance of his tenure. This was challenged by these three civil society organizations. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court found that the arrangement was unlawful and improper, and set it aside. But I'll come back to that in a moment. He was then succeeded by Sean Abrams, again appointed by President Zuma. And I think many of us will recall that I think in his first press conference after his appointment, he famously or infamously said that the days of disrespecting the NPA are over. That was a very short-lived statement. I think many of us would now agree. He faced incredible criticism, this being in the height of the state capture era, and challenges over allegations of political bias and succumbing to external influence. In but one example, there were charges of perjury leveled against Nonkobo Jiba, who was then a Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions. On assuming office, Mr. Abrams withdrew those charges against her very quickly. He openly admitted to going to Luthuli House to meet with the ANC officials, and therefore his position as NDPP was seriously compromised. I think he earned the nickname from the media of Shaun the Sheep, of kowtowing to the political forces at the time. As I say, as part of the challenge to the Nkosana Golden Handshake, Shaun Abrams' appointment was declared invalid by the Constitutional Court because the court held that there was no vacancy that required to be filled because Mr. Nkosana had been unlawfully vacated office. Moving on onto the present, Shamila Batoy, as we will recall, the first female permanent NDPP in South Africa, was appointed in 2019. Shamila had a long career at the NPA, starting out, I think, in the Chatsworth Magistrates Court in KZN, moving on to head the Scorpions in the province before becoming the Director of Public Prosecutions in KZN, before she left in 2009 to take up a position as an advisor to the senior prosecutor at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, position that she held for almost 10 years. Before she applied for the vacant NDPP position. And as you highlighted in your introduction, Kabisha, there was a panel process led by the Minister of Justice, and including many other legal experts, that interviewed a list of candidates in public, and that panel, I think, gave a short list, if I'm not mistaken, of 5 names to the president from which to choose the next NDPP. President Ramaphosa then appointed Shamila as the NDPP, taking office, I think, in February of 2019. As we well know, this was an institution that was ravaged during the state capture years. Its ability to prosecute without fear, favor, or compromise was seriously compromised in those years, particularly under Shaun Abrams' tenure. And Advocate Batoy had to set out to restore public confidence and credibility in the NPA from that time. And I think we can probably safely say that that remains a work in progress, and the unfinished business of Shamila Batoy's tenure. I think she has herself acknowledged that the challenge facing her when she assumed office was much greater than she had imagined, and it has certainly taken a lot longer than she imagined, and I think a lot longer than many of us would have liked to see. She has faced challenges relating to the resource constraints, internal divisions within the NPA, with clear factional divisions having existed over a long period of time through the successive leadership, highly politicized leaderships of the NPA over the years. I think it must be said that she is widely perceived as having been ineffective in ensuring the prosecution of state capture, people involved or implicated in state capture. I think that probably deserves a webinar of its own to unpack. But she can count as amongst her successes, I would say, that she persuaded the president to establish the IDAC, the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, in the NPA, which has now been established as a permanent entity within the NPA, often referred to as Scorpions 2.0, because it's a prosecution-led investigative agency within the NPA, very much like the Scorpions were back in the 2000s. So in rounding off, I just wanted to touch on a couple of key acting NDPP positions. There have been several over the years, but the ones that stand out for, I think, for the purposes of this discussion relate to Mokotedi Mshe. I've referenced that one earlier. He stepped in after Vusi Pikoli had been suspended and prior to the appointment of Menzi Simelane. And as I said earlier, it was during his tenure that he withdrew controversially, I might add, withdrew the corruption charges against President against Jacob Zuma, allowing him ultimately to become president in 2009. And then we had the tenure of Nankobo Jiba for a couple of years, from late 2011 to 2013. And again, there was a highly politicized environment, very much in the corner of President Jacob Zuma. We saw selective prosecutions, withdrawal of charges against people like Richard Mbruli and others. Ultimately, President Ramaphosa established another inquiry into the fitness of both Jiba and Lawrence Ngwebi, their fitness to hold office in 2018, 2019, and they Justice, the late Justice Yvonne Mohoro, came to the conclusion that they were both unfit to hold office, and they were then removed from office at the NPA as Deputy National Director, and I think Ngwebi was a Special National Director of Public Prosecutions. They were removed in 2019. We then had the tenure of Silas Ramaite before the appointment of Shamila Batoy in 2019. So in conclusion, where to from here? And I know Gareth is going to take the conversation forward, so I'm not going to step on his toes. As I said, Shamila Batoy is set to retire early next year because she will be turning 65. But the NPA Act provides that the president may elect to extend the term of a person who is reaching the retirement age for up to 2 more years. Now, we have no idea whether that is something that President Ramaphosa is currently contemplating, or whether he's simply going to proceed with a process to appoint a new national director in the coming months. Gareth will deal with the issue of the appointment process, and just the final thought I want to leave is the Constitution says very clearly that the national director is appointed by the president acting as head of the national executive. So, in my view, even if a panel is appointed, and one hopes that ultimately that the establishment of such a public panel to scrutinize candidates for top offices in the NPA will be something that will be formalized in law. I do not believe that it will require a constitutional change, because that recommendation will still, in any event, come from the panel to the president, who will then exercise his powers in terms of the Constitution to make that appointment. So let me stop there and hand over back to you, Kavisha.
Thanks so much, Lawson. That was really insightful. If it wasn't all so tragic and unfortunate, it fits the bill for a really good Netflix documentary on how to on how to collapse a public prosecution authority. And I think the sort of similarities of what we've seen in South Africa is playing out in the States at the moment, in terms of what's going on there. So Gareth, over to you, and talk to us about the appointment processes, upcoming appointments, and what we should be advocating for as civil society.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this event today. And thanks, Lawson, for that great summary of what we've had to experience over the years. Brought back many not so happy memories, but it was certainly an experience to be watching these prosecutors, the national directors being appointed, with their permanent positions or not, and all the court cases and the way and the intrigues that followed them in their office, and then how they eventually left. And so I suppose this is a big and important issue, and it's beyond the NPA. I mean, just so you know, I mean, the head of the Hawks, Lieutenant General Godfrey de Beer's last day in office is tomorrow. And we don't know who's taking over from him. And ideally, you would have a process, especially in these highly sensitive positions where people have immense powers to investigate, to support the prosecution of very powerful people in our country, that there's some kind of a handover process. You don't have this gap where you put in these acting people, because people who are in acting positions in these critical posts are more likely to yield to pressure from the political principals, especially if they think this might favor them in getting the post permanently. And as you saw from Nomkobo Jiba, she was in an acting position for 2 years, and for some reason hasn't been prosecuted for perjury, which was well proven in a number of the court cases that she lied before the court. Anyway, that being said, I think it does talk about the process, and there's a few other issues I'll raise as well, because the NDPP is not the most powerful person in the NPA. There are a number of other very powerful people. So the head of the National Prosecuting Service, which is one of the Deputy Director National Prosecutors, is also immensely powerful. They control a lot of what's going on in the courts, what happens there. And then, of course, the provincial prosecutors, the special prosecutors and provincial prosecutors have huge leeway to make decisions about who to prosecute or not to prosecute, or who prosecutes certain cases. And many cases, the NDPP can only really review certain issues if they're brought to her office. If there's a complaint or evidence of wrongdoing, she can then get involved at that point. Or in a limited number of other prosecutions, she has to give prior authorization. For example, prosecuting racketeering and certain positions in government. So, although she's the public head of the NPA, in many ways, there are many other posts that are also critically important for that institution to operate as effectively as it needs to operate if we're going to get on top of our serious violent organized crime and corruption challenges. And of course, the first step on that is really the appointment process. And as Lawson so clearly pointed out, virtually up until Shamila Batoy, we would wake up one day and there'd be an announcement. The president would say, "This is the person who is now taking over this post." And we would have to just put up with that. There'd be no chance for the civil society or the media to get to know who this person was, what are their strengths, what are their challenges, why were they chosen, was never quite clear. But the other appointments made by the president hardly ever would make the news. And that's, I think it's the top 14 posts or more of the NPA are actually appointed by the president. And that's why, for example, Lawrence Mwebi, who wasn't, the national director, could only be removed via board of inquiry. So there's quite a layer of protection to prosecutors, which is a good thing. They can't just be removed. There has to be a board of inquiry that really gets into the fitness of their office. But there was so little due diligence done in appointing people. So you could put people into that position who had been found, for example, the Ginewala Commission in the case of Menzi Simelane, as not being fit for that position, potentially having also lied under oath, and being appointed there, or the prosecutor that followed Sean Abrams, who had criminal convictions and investigations against them. So how you appoint people into those positions is critically important. And we really, as civil society, need to make our voices very clear that we would like a transparent appointment process so that we know who the people are in the running and get a chance to get to know more about them, and that the process, the interview panel exactly, is live and it's transmitted to everybody so we can see how they answer questions and so forth. The transparency in the appointment of Shamila Batoy wasn't given. I mean, that had to be a court fight as well, a court case as well, or a threatened court case, because the president still wanted that process to be behind closed doors. It was good to have that panel. It was a senior panel, mostly of people who work in the field, people who are lawyers, advocates, Chapter 9 institutions, and so forth. So that was a great precedent setting. And I think that's what we need to look forward to in the future as well. We would like to see a panel being announced as previously. They then come up with a shortlist. Their initial shortlist was 12 people. Glenys Breitenbach was on that shortlist. She then withdrew, so it was down to 11. But even in that shortlist, 3 of the prosecutors that were on that shortlist, there were very, very serious questions about them and how they even became to be on the shortlist. So, for example, Advocate Norco and Advocate Andrew Chauke, who's still in the NPA, had very serious public and damning allegations against them related to state capture. In fact, the NPA has asked the president to hold up a board of inquiry into Advocate Chauke, who's still in charge of the Gauteng South Division. He managed to get on the shortlist. And then we've got an Advocate Matrick Lepondo, who's currently facing criminal conviction for corruption. So all of those three people got into the initial shortlist. And had there been a different president, could have possibly become the next NDPP and would have continued down the path that we were on beforehand. Unfortunately, the panel did have come up with the shortest, a much smaller shortlist. I think of about 3 advocates. Advocate Beloy was on that shortlist. She'd been a prosecutor since 1986. Had really excelled as a prosecutor. Had been appointed. I mean, she worked with Frank Dutton, and she looked at special investigations into political violence, and then worked internationally in The Hague. So had both national and international experience and was well regarded. But again, I think, it's not just that you have a transparent appointment process. I think we also need to know, what are the criteria? Are we asking the same questions of every candidate? What are we actually looking for? And that's been a huge weakness in the appointment process for Chapter 9 institutions. For example, how public protectors are appointed. There's not a very clear standard. What are you actually looking for? If this person's supposed to be independent or heading an independent body, then surely people who've only ever worked for the state can't really be expected to be that independent, because they've possibly been imbued with a culture of being different to their political principles. I'm not saying they should be prohibited, but you'd need to then really explore, how independent is this person? For example, you'd need to really make those criteria quite clear. And then, of course, make sure that each candidate is asked the same questions so you can assess them against each other, and really give the public a chance to really sort of get to know these people. And that's good for them. That means that once they're appointed and they've managed to step into that position, they step into that post with people having a level of confidence, knowing who they are, knowing a bit about them, how they view their position, what they're going to do. That enables them to really garner more public support, which is what they're going to need in these high profile and very sensitive and often conflictual positions. And also the organization needs to know what they're dealing with. So I think, we really would like to see this happen for the next NDPP, if indeed there is going to be a replacement for Shamila Batoy in January or February next year. But again, that's we can't only look at the NDPP. And first of all, that's a precedent that was set by Cyril Ramaphosa as president, given that he would like that process to be followed. There's nothing in law that can be changed again. So when he's no longer the president, and we don't really know at all who will be the next president, and there are some potentially quite shady characters who are slowly working their way towards putting their hands up for that post, would not be constrained by any process at all. They could simply go back to the Zuma era appointments or the Mbeki era appointments, where you just choose somebody you know and like and you think will be loyal to you, and we'd be back to where we were for all that disastrous period where we had the challenges we've had. So we really need to see these processes in law. We don't need to change the constitution. The president can make the appointment using his or her authority, executive authority, but we do need to have a legal process that sets out how that person is selected and appointed, so that there's a constraint against appointing people who have got problematic pasts, criminal records, and so the president's authority really is constrained to having a limited number of people who they appointed who've been properly vetted, publicly assessed, and so we know that they could do the job without fear or favor. And then, of course, it must be extended to the other posts I've mentioned. We can't have a situation where the president's making all these appointments, but we don't have clarity on who these people are. Certainly under the current dispensation or administration, and the previous one under Cyril Ramaphosa and Shamila Batoy, the NDPP was able to make recommendations. So Shamila Batoy was able to say, okay, there's a vacancy in this province or in this position, and then she could make a recommendation to the Minister of Justice and the President, and by and large, they seem to have followed her recommendations. But again, if that situation changes with a less than highly honest president, they could again flood the NPA with very senior people who should not be there, who would have immense power in different provinces to prosecute or not prosecute certain cases. And even if there might be I'll just go back to cases of corruption in the Gauteng South High Court that weren't prosecuted, where there may be no undue or worrying reason why that decision was taken not to continue the prosecution. The mere fact that there is clouds over the head of that division always will raise questions, and it automatically undermines people's trust in these important state bodies. So that is why you need to make sure that every single person is well and transparently appointed. So that is about the appointments, and of course, we would like to see a process where these processes happen before the person leaves office, so there's not a period of time where acting appointments need to be made. Mostly because the acting appointments cannot be as independent. They are subject to being removed immediately following any process. And secondly, that there's proper handover. Surely if you are in that position, you're not going to take over the NPA or any other important agency in the state involved in law enforcement. You'd really like to get up to speed with what are the challenges, what was the obstacles faced by the previous incumbent, what are the kind of political pressures they're facing, so that you're able to prepare yourself. And that ideally would mean that the appointment was made before the serving person leaves. But that being said, even if the NPA had the best possible woman or man as the next NDPP, so we got somebody who was as experienced as Shamila Batoya, but even far more charismatic, could really give these incredible speeches to the public, which meant that the public really sort of loved her and wanted to be behind her, and the media loved her, and there was no doubt that she was independent. Again, the institution itself is so compromised because of the way it is structured. It is still a program within the Department of Justice. If it wants to go overseas to collect evidence, if it wants to track the Gupta extradition process, it needs authority from the Director General. It is not in the room when budgets are discussed. It can't make decisions easily about itself, about maybe bringing in a special counsel or external people to prosecute key cases. It is completely subject to the decisions of the Minister of Justice through the Director General of Justice in that situation. So the institution itself, whereas the individual prosecutors may be independent, they can decide whether or not to prosecute fear or favor. All the support around them, the training they receive, their laptops, their equipment, their offices, whether they can travel, is all has to be approved elsewhere. And that is something that really needs to be looked at. So in short, we really do need to see a complete overhaul of the NPA Act to ensure that it is able to have complete financial independence, that it's able to improve its own transparency and accountability, that it's able to bring in special counsel, private prosecutors, people do private advocates and that, without having to get permission from another structure. And as we saw with the Zondo Commission's database, where they couldn't get access to it on their own terms, they could get limited bits and pieces, and absolutely nonsensical reasons were given as to why they couldn't. That just goes to show the heart of the challenge is beyond the appointment process. So we, as much as we must advocate for transparency in the appointment of these top positions, we also need to see a completely overhaul of the legislation so that this institution can really be independent, and that those independent people, those men and women who are prosecuting very important cases every day, every week in South Africa, this institution is able to support them properly, that they can be trained according to the training needs they would need, they can travel, they can get the evidence they want, they can bring in special people. And that means possibly, for example, restructuring their remuneration scales to be levels to be the same as the SIU, or given special dispensation as the SARS is, so they're not constrained by public sector bureaucracy, because this institution is so critically important. And the nature of the crimes that he's going to be facing keep changing. There's now cyber crimes, there's now hacking, there's incredibly sophisticated ways of hiding money that has been stolen through corruption in offshore accounts, tracing illicit financial flows across the jurisdictions. People working with, forensic accountants, chartered accountants, highly skilled lawyers. I'm talking about organized crime, who are streets ahead of the skills, capacity, flexibility, and responsiveness that the NPA can be, while it's jammed into a bureaucratic structure that says you can only be paid this much and you can have to get an application to do this before you do that. So, beyond the appointment process, we do need to see an overhaul of that institution so that it really can be fit for purpose to deal with the very serious organized crime and corruption challenges that we are facing. About a year ago, more than a year ago, we were actually told at a workshop that draft legislation was already in place and that it just needed to be approved by the Minister of Justice and then brought before Parliament, and that was likely to happen in January this year. Here we are in May, and we don't see that legislation anywhere. Time is running short. The institution, if Cyril Ramaphosa really wants to have a lasting legacy as a president, I think he'll get on top of some of those legislative requirements, some of those Zondo Commission recommendations, and some of the recommendations from the National Anti-Corruption Council as soon as possible, so that he can make sure that these structures are in law and in place and operational before he leaves. Because right now we have absolutely no idea who's going to be following him. And unfortunately, crime, organized crime, corruption, and politics have become so deeply enmeshed that we need to make hay while the sun shines. Anyway, I'll end there, and I look forward to an interesting discussion and debate.
Great. Thank you so much, Gareth. So much to unpack from what you said, but we clearly do have a very long way to go in terms of overhauling legislation, trying to improve appointment processes, and just making sure that the NPA is going to be fit for purpose in an increasingly complex digital world that we're now in, where the crimes are changing. I would like to open up for some Q&As. There are some comments in the chat, but if anybody would like to come to the floor, please do raise your hand and we will then unmute you. Not seeing any hands at the moment. But Judge Krichler is making some important inputs about the criteria for the appointment being crucial and should be determined at the outset of the process, and that the process should both create public confidence and find the best candidates, but ultimately is approved by as the PP proved, the best process cannot guarantee a good result. Therefore, the identity of the panel is crucial. I think we can all agree on that. What I would ask perhaps to both you, Gareth and Lawson, is what can we do reasonably as civil society? How should we be collaborating? What are the potential advocacy points, practical suggestions that we can start to take on board and build on that, so that we're not going to wake up one day with a new NDPP and that's it, it's done and dusted. Lawson, can I start with you, and then Gareth, hand to you for any ideas that you may have?
Thanks, Kavisha. Look, I think a webinar like this is an important part of that process of raising the public profile of the issue, that people become aware that Advocate Matoye will be vacating office early next year. And then if we are going to have a thorough process, that selection process has to start quite soon. Because it's not about having somebody appointed in January next year to replace her in February, but you want someone appointed at least a few months before that, so that there can be a proper handover process. I think what I demonstrated earlier is with the sort of the manner in which previous NDPPs have departed. There's been no handover process, so it's disruptive to the organization. And whilst we might be critical of the progress that has been made under Shamila Batoy, we can't deny that there has been progress, and that we need to, the next person needs to be able to build on that. And the proper handover is important. I just reiterate what Gareth said. Whilst the process that the president followed the last time, he doesn't need to follow that again. Although I think he has bound himself by setting that precedent. We may want to look and comment on the actual composition of that panel, because I think the point Justice Kriegler made in the comment is the composition of the panel is critically important to getting the right person there. So the Act doesn't say much in terms of what constitutes fit and proper. It has been unpacked to a certain extent in some of the jurisprudence that we have. It was unpacked in both the reports of the Ginwala and Mahoro inquiries. So there's stuff to work with, but it needs to be formalized in a way that the right tests are made. Ultimately, I think, again, as Gareth pointed out, this person sits at the head of the NPA, but they're not the most powerful person there. They're not taking day-to-day prosecutorial decisions. What you really want is an efficient manager and administrator to run a very large and complex organization. So, sometimes the best prosecutors don't make the best managers. So we need to guard against those kinds of things. What exactly are we looking for? But I think, in response to your question, the issue is we need an open, transparent process. There's a panel-like structure would seem to be a good one to use to replicate what was done in 2018. And ultimately, as part of this process of strengthening the independence of the NPA, to have that formalized in law, as well as the other aspects of the NPA that need to be protected. Thanks.
Thanks, Lawson. Gareth, before you come in, I see there's a question from Gary Pina, who's from the HSRC, and Gary is asking, what is the quickest way to ensure that clear and appropriate criteria and a best practice process are adopted before the position is advertised? Because there's probably insufficient time to amend the NPA Act. Lawson, if you also have any comments on that, feel free to jump in after Gareth.
Well, maybe just to tackle that question first, the quickest way would be for the Department of Justice to set up an independent panel of experts to come up with the criteria and then present those criteria to the President and the Minister of Justice and say, we really think you should do this. That'd be the quickest. I don't know if the Justice Department can move that quickly, but that speaks to then maybe civil society's role. I think we can come up with those criteria, we can look at what other countries have done. We can then, and I agree with Lawson, the one role we must play is public awareness. Just make people aware that this is happening, why it's important. Being able to explain that to different constituencies so that there's just this awareness about it, and hopefully there's pressure for it. And there's various ways we can do that. That's obviously either through the media or traditional media, social media, or just making this part of everyday discussion in different forums and aspects where we work and operate. And then, of course, there's more formal advocacy. We can really start putting submissions before the Justice Portfolio Committee. We can write to the Minister of Justice, try and get campaigns around that, to the President, and make that public as well. So, we can work together to say who should be on the panel. What should the panel criteria be? What have other countries done? What seems to work? There is no real foolproof way of doing this, and it is quite a difficult challenge. I think you'll see internationally sort of that position of being the prosecutor. In most jurisdictions, there's a hesitancy to have a completely independent person there. And sometimes where there has been a very independent person, but it's gone against the, say, the political sentiment at the time, they find various ways to remove that person, as was the case with Vusi Pikoli. So it's just something that we need to work as different institutions to think about what are the avenues of trying to get our recommendations through. And then so there are the portfolio committees, but there's also things like the National Planning Commission. We can engage with them. There are various law societies that might want to take this up and make an issue about it. There's the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that are making recommendations. So it's potentially trying to engage with them as many as possible, and then getting them to use their influence and their access to say maybe these people as well. There's the deputy ministers. Sometimes the deputy ministers are more available and amenable. You could have seminars, invite them to come and discuss these issues. Yeah, so there's a variety of ways that we can act, and I think we are in the process of looking at this, and I think as various organizations are. And I think it's about keeping people appraised of what's happening, how they can play a role, so that we do the best we can, as much as we can. Of course, unfortunately, with real power, you can be ignored. I think civil society is quite used to being ignored, but often we are successful. Then, of course, there are the courts as a last resort, if an irrational appointment is made, but that's obviously the slowest way to change things. So there's a variety of ways which I think South African civil society can and does act, and can make a difference.
Great. Thanks so much, Gareth. I'm not seeing any further comments or inputs from the audience, so I think we are at a point where we can
Can
wrap
I
up.
come
Oh,
in
sorry.
on? Yeah,
Yes.
just on that, in sort of answering Gary's question, I don't think an amendment of the NPA Act is necessary, because the provisions of the Act are very broad as they stand. So I think the point is to unpack what that means, and the relevant part of the Act says that the person to be appointed as National Director, Deputy National Director, or Director must be a fit and proper person with due regard to his or her experience, conscientiousness, and integrity to be entrusted with the responsibilities of the office concerned. So it's not an abstract notion of fit and proper. It's fit and proper in relation to the responsibilities of running the NPA. And I would agree with Gareth that setting up the right kind of panel can and trusting them to develop that set of clear criteria that is set out well in advance of the process starting, so people who apply know what is expected of them. When the interviews are conducted, we know what we're measuring people against.
Yeah. Thanks, Lawson. That's really helpful and important. So we've just hit 12 o'clock. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this discussion. I'm sure that it's not going to be the last. We have our instructions that we need to be raising awareness that this appointment is coming up, that this appointment is key. And even though the NDPP is not the most powerful position in the NPA, it is a very critical position in terms of ensuring that we have a functional and healthy prosecuting authority. So I will ask for Defend Our Democracy and other civil society organizations and partners who are on the call to continue with convening so that we can strategize and brainstorm on what we should be doing, and that we run a large-scale public awareness campaign, that we engage with Parliament and political parties and NACAC and anybody else who will be able to try and influence, and that we do our best because we know how vital these appointment processes are. And as Gary said, we do live in hope. So even though things have not always gone our way, we need to, we first have to at least start that fight instead of giving up at the start. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you to Lawson and Gareth for your continuous work and advocacy in these important spaces. We really do appreciate the hard work and effort that goes into this. And yeah, we look forward to having more of these discussions and seeing some practical campaigns and efforts on the ground. On that note, thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon, and we will chat soon. Bye.
Thanks, Kavisha. Democracy. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.